Australia is the greatest nation on earth, and at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Well, hello, Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be back for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. Today, Tony will be sharing his insights on the events across the world, Australia this year, and what we have to look forward to as we head to the next election. And Tony will also be sharing his thoughts on the ABC documentary about the coalition's time in government. Tony, great to be back having a chat with you.
Thanks, Dan. Lovely to be here.
Well, let's kick off, Tony. You've delivered a very significant speech in London recently about the global order, the challenges facing the Western world. I think it was very well received. It's been reported on in an opinion piece and also in some news items in The Australian earlier this week. Could you, just to start with, give our viewers and listeners an overview of what it was you were discussing and the challenges that you see facing Australia and the West?
Well, thanks, Dan. I was in London for, amongst other things, the launching of a major report about the AUKUS alliance. This was a report by the Legatum Institute that called for AUKUS to become caucus through the inclusion of Canada in the second pillar of the AUKUS security arrangements. But I did take the chance to make a more general speech about the deteriorating security situation that democracies face. Now, people have been saying for the last few years that these times have a disturbing echo of the 1930s. Unfortunately, the echo of the 1930s is getting much more pronounced as time goes by, and yet there's nothing like a comparable sense of urgency in the West's preparations to deter the various challenges that we face. And I'm afraid weakness is a provocation. It's not a deterrence. The only thing that deters dictators is strength. And if anything, our strength is fading rather than increasing. So I guess I started with the most recent warnings from the British Defence Minister, amongst others, that we have moved from a post-war to a pre-war world. I then canvassed the scale of the challenges we face. Obviously, there's a challenge from militarist Russia. Obviously, in the evil assault on Ukraine, there's the Islamists, the apocalyptic Islamists who populate Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran and other movements in the Middle East, and the assault on Israel, which is currently underway. And we've got brooding in the background, threatening to come into the foreground at any minute, the challenge of communist China. Now, it's a dreadful mistake to think that just because war is unimaginable to us, that dictators don't think of this all the time. It's a dreadful mistake to think that their words are really just for domestic consumption, that they don't convey any real meaning. A dictator is a bit like the mafia. If you make a threat, you've got to carry it out, because like the mafia, dictatorships survive on fear, and you only generate fear if your threats are credible. So when you've got Xi Jinping repeating again and again and again that China must reclaim, in his mind, Taiwan, and must do it soon, by force if necessary, we have to take it seriously. When we have the constant declarations from Beijing that Beijing aims to dominate the East Asian region in the near term, and at least by 2050 be the world's number one power, we have to take that seriously. And we see a de facto alliance between China, Russia and Iran. China is certainly buying Russia's oil and gas to keep their coffers full. The Iranians are supplying drones and other equipment to the Russians. The North Koreans, who are effectively a client of Beijing, are massively resupplying Russia with artillery shells and so on. So what you've got is this network of dictatorships, communist, militarist and Islamist, working together to confront the democracies. On the other hand, you also see an extreme reluctance on the part of the Republicans in the US Congress to continue to fund and arm Ukraine, notwithstanding that the Ukrainians are fighting for everyone's freedom, not just their own. There are growing calls throughout the West for Israel to abandon its fight back against Hamas. That's what a ceasefire would be. It would be allowing Hamas to survive, regroup, and do it all again. And at the same time, you've got this persistent strategic ambiguity in respect of Taiwan. Now, if Beijing thinks that an attack on Taiwan is simply 1.4 billion Chinese against 25 million Taiwanese, an attack is inevitable. In order for an attack to be avoided, Beijing needs to think that it might very well be China versus the world, or at least a coalition of democracies, if it is to be deterred. Now, I absolutely accept that any major war using modern weaponry would be an incalculable catastrophe, but the collapse of the US alliance system would be an equal catastrophe. Imagine a world that is dominated by China or indeed by apocalyptic Islam. Billions of people could find themselves in the situation that the Uyghurs currently in, or that the Yazidis recently were in. This is why it is essential, it is a complete imperative that all liberal democratic countries, everyone who values freedom, everyone who believes that nation states should be able to do their own thing in their own way, needs to be thinking this through and preparing themselves for every eventuality.
Well, Tony, it's a very comprehensive assessment of the situation we find ourselves in. One of the things I liked so much about your speech as edited in your article today was you contrast those nations, the hostile nations you mentioned, with ourselves, and you say our nations, our countries as in the Western democracies, are massively subsidising wind and solar energy and deindustrialising in the process, because we still think that the greatest threat to our well-being is increased atmospheric carbon dioxide and a possible degree or two of temperature rise in decades hence, end quote. And then you go on to say, well, look at what these other nations are doing in rebuilding their military capabilities, basically. You touched on something very important, and this is what Jim Molan used to talk about a lot, which was national security is a whole of economy, a whole of society matter. It's not just energy as it relates to economics, is energy as it relates to your industrial manufacturing capability and so forth. Can you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts of the challenges we face in energy and climate and the impact on our national security and defence?
Well, Dan, Jim Molan was absolutely right. And very few people had thought as deeply about these things as the late Jim Molan, because he'd spent his whole life thinking about what are the elements of national strength, what are the determinants of national resilience, what makes some countries succeed and others fail.
Yep.
And in his magisterial final book, Danger on Our Doorstep, which I recommend to anyone who is concerned about the geopolitical situation, he made this very point, that it's not just a question of adequate armed forces, although we are woefully lacking here in Australia, but it's also a question of economic strength and cultural strength. And at the moment, policy is deliberately weakening our economy, I would argue, and lack of leadership, institutional timidity, I suppose cultural self-loathing is doing enormous damage to our national morale. So just if we can focus on each of those elements, you look at the state of our armed forces. It's a long time since we've got ourselves any major new naval assets. Yes, there's the air warfare destroyers. Yes, there's the helicopter carriers, but the helicopter carriers are hardly protected. The air warfare destroyers, there's just 3 of them. The ageing Anzac frigates, one of them's already been taken out of service through lack of personnel. 2 more are at risk of being taken out of service through lack of personnel. Yep. The government says that they didn't send a frigate to the Red Sea because they want to focus on our region. I fear that the real reason is that they don't have the sailors, and they were frightened that any frigate of ours might be at serious risk from swarming drones. We've got the AUKUS submarines coming in time, but in the meantime, the defence budget is being completely hollowed out to pay for the submarines. Every other element of the defence budget is being squeezed to pay for the submarines because the government is refusing to increase the defence budget. We've got a whole lot of programs that are in jeopardy. There's the new frigates, which are billions over budget, years behind time. There's helicopters that don't really work, the ones we've just taken out of service and buried, the Taipans. There's the Tigers that have never been fully operational. There's the Hawkeye armoured vehicle, which is still not fully operational, quite a few years after first being handed over to the Army. So our defences, frankly, are in a dire state. And while I'm sure that the ministers and the officials are doing their best, they don't seem to be getting their act together. That's the problem. Now, there doesn't appear to be any real sense of urgency. For instance, if the report in one of our papers last week is to be believed, we are proposing to conduct an 8-year study into offensive and defensive drones before actually making an acquisition decision, when it's obvious from the Ukraine war that the modern battle space is completely dependent upon offensive and defensive drones. So that's the military position. We've touched on it a moment ago, whether it's workplace relations changes, which are going to weaken productivity, not strengthen it, whether it's increases in government spending, not very efficient government spending often, which is going to sap the economy, whether it's I think, almost insanely counterproductive energy policy, which you and I have spoken about on many occasions, which is making it very difficult to continue heavy industry in this country. We've got all sorts of self-inflicted economic hobbles. And then, of course, there's this whole cultural issue. Now, a country which isn't sure whether it wants to celebrate Australia Day, and while the public are pretty keen to celebrate, the people in charge are far from confident that we need to. A country that doesn't believe in itself can't defend itself. So I think there are a lot of very worrying factors. And while people in leadership positions from the Prime Minister down pay lip service to the need for change, nothing much is happening anytime soon. This is why I say in the speech that we are sleepwalking through Lotus Land. Even Neville Chamberlain, who has been given a pretty bum rap by history as the architect of appeasement, even Neville Chamberlain, when he came back from Munich in 1938 and announced peace in our time, knew that the peace would not hold. and began increasing aircraft production at breakneck speed, which was why 2 years later, at the time of the Battle of Britain, they had enough Spitfires and Hurricanes just to save the country and ultimately to save the free world. So without wanting to, as it were, frighten people or scare people, because I would like people to be resolute rather than fearful, there is so much that needs to be done and so little that is actually taking place.
So, Tony, what would be, if you could wave your magic wand, what would be your suggestions or advice for how to start to get not only our military operations back up to scratch, but also the broader environment within which we're using those operations? What would be your sort of top 3 or 5 things that you would like to see happen in our country?
Well, I think to start off with, we've got to level with people about the challenges we face, and we've then got to have a realistic path forward. So in military terms, we do need to make some decisions very quickly about what we're going to do with the offshore patrol vessels armament, what we're going to do with the new frigates, how we are going to maintain a submarine deterrent prior to the AUKUS submarines. I think that at the very least, we should be offering to send some fast jets to Cyprus and support the Royal Air Force's operations against the Houthis. I think that would be an important signal that Australia is a contributing part of the Western Alliance. I think we should be talking to the Japanese about rotating some ships and planes through the bases in southern Japan. I think we've got to say economically that, yes, we want to preserve the environment by all means, but we are not going to take any steps to further limit emissions that are going to cause short-term economic pain. So we shouldn't be closing down any more coal-fired power stations without a reliable alternative. We should be rapidly developing gas reserves, because apart from anything else, we need to be a source of resource security to our important regional partners like Japan, South Korea, India, and so on. But above all else, we've got to start believing in ourselves. Now, what happened on the 26th of January 1788, and again, this is a topic we've discussed before, that was not something about which we should be embarrassed. It's something about which we should be proud. On the 26th of January 1788, the modern world, Western civilization, came into this ancient continent. Now, it was not necessarily a smooth entrance. There were some rough edges, absolutely. But every single Australian, Aboriginal or not Aboriginal, is so much the better off today and has almost always been better off because of what happened on the 26th of January 1788 and beyond. The country that we have created here is a country to be proud of. It's free, it's fair, it's prosperous, it's decent in a way that very few other countries are. The only countries to rival us are essentially our fellow members of the Anglosphere, which is why we do need not only to have faith in ourselves, but we should do everything we humanly can to deepen our links with the other countries of the Anglosphere and indeed to promote closer partnerships with like-minded countries. Obviously, Japan is a key strategic partner because the Japanese have skin in the game in a way that very few other countries do. India also has skin in this game. There's been some bad history if you go back far enough. But India is a democracy under the rule of law. It's not a strategic challenge to Australia or the other Western countries. It will take quite a while to build up the same level of intimacy with India that we have, say, with Japan or even with countries such as Israel. But nevertheless, that should be one of our important long-term goals. And this really, Dan, has to be a multi-generational task. it's not something that you can do once and forget. One of the terrible weaknesses of contemporary government is we have such a short attention span. I suppose what I'm really saying, Dan, is there needs to be a rediscovery of seriousness of purpose at every level. And I guess that starts with remembering our history, remembering our strengths and building on them rather than focusing on the extraordinary trivia that most of us spend so much time focusing on, such as I don't think there's been any media over the last couple of days that hasn't absolutely obsessed about a certain senior Canberra member of Parliament who happened to topple off a planter box. Well, big deal. Who cares? If anything, the bloke deserves sympathy, not endless speculation.
Well, talking about trivial matters, Tony, I want to talk about the year ahead as well, but given that you've sort of started to talk about, from the very serious issues that you're discussing to the trivial matters that concerns our media class, there was, of course, the documentary on the coalition government. And I did watch it. The good news is it's on the ABC, so very few other Australians watched it. So that's something to bear in mind. But watching it, Tony, I couldn't help think a couple of things. The first is I don't remember hearing any of these people complain when you won 90 seats. That's the first thing. The second thing is something that comes up a lot is in terms of your period as Prime Minister is, this sort of retrospective look at the 2014 budget. Well, okay, fair enough to debate different measures and so on and so forth. But I didn't hear anyone offering an alternative set of policies or ideas. Everyone accepted we needed to fix the budget. You went out there, made the argument, put your measures in place, and your Treasurer, Joe Hockey. It's easy to look back and complain, but where were the other ideas and leadership at the time? So those were a couple of things that came into mind. But Tony, I know that you've actually, watching the documentary, I have to say there's only one person that came out of it looking better than when they went in, and that was you, because you chose not to comment on it, and I think that's right. But if you wanted to share your thoughts.
Well, Dan, look, the ABC really laid siege to me, if you like, for months, asking me to get involved. And I guess my response was that I had already written 3 essays for Quadrant back in 2016, giving my take on the Abbott government, and having reread one of them, which Quadrant republished online the other day, I'm still not sure that there's anything I could usefully add. So I thought I'd given my take on all of that. I'm not really one of those people who likes to rake over old coals. Sure, learn the lessons of any experience that you've got, but let's not rake over old coals. And I certainly don't think that much purpose is served by engaging in retrospective vilification of people. It was what it was. Different people did different things. I did my best. Some people liked it. Some people didn't. And I think I should just, as it were, let the record speak for itself, the good, the bad, the indifferent, and leave it to the judgment of history.
And, in terms of the record, unfortunately, the documentary didn't actually go over your government's record, which was getting rid of the carbon tax, the mining tax, the free trade deals, the various processes that you had started, whether it was tax reform or federation reform, and the many other initiatives, including in that 2014 budget, dealing with a hostile Senate, trying to get rid of lawfare, Section 487, defunding the Environmental Defender's Office, which is, again, an issue in the media and many other such matters. So it really did lack any kind of balance.
It's really in the nature of those sorts of programs. They deal with personalities, not policies. And I can understand why a lot of people love the human drama. But in the end, it's not whether people like each other in government, it's whether the government does good work.
Yep.
And yet that's almost inevitably not the focus of these programs, which was one of the many reasons why I thought it was best not to take part.
No, fair enough. I think you made the right call. I did want to draw you out on one thing that struck me was a lot of the commentary, I won't go into sort of the specifics of it, but a lot of the commentary was around you would do something or your government would do something, the media wouldn't like it, and then people got concerned about it and wanted to retreat immediately. Now, sometimes retreat is the sensible thing, but sometimes it is not. And I just wanted to, without commenting on necessarily on specifics, I wanted to get your perspective on the role of the media. And of course, when you take a decision that may be unpopular or that some in the chattering classes may not agree with, of course there will be pushback. But can you give us an insight into that dynamic? And you had a very unique leadership style, I think certainly over the last couple of decades, where you had conviction, you would make an argument on the carbon tax. No one believed you would ever get rid of it, but you did. And many other such things. So give us an insight into the dynamics of the short-term media cycle and attempts by our leaders to achieve long-term change.
Well, I think I'm making a general observation now. I think politics is harder today than it was even a decade ago, let alone 2 or 3 decades ago. I think that the Hawke and Howard governments would have more trouble doing the good work they did today than they had at the time. I think that social media and the 24/7 media cycle has been a real problem. I think one of the other difficulties is that the news pages and the editorial pages are not in sync. I don't want to single out particular newspapers because I'd end up probably singling out papers that on balance I support, but a paper might have a very sound editorial line, but the headlines scream the opposite. To give you an example, all of the headlines coming out of the recent climate conference in Dubai were the usual climate alarmism. When you actually delve into it, it was probably the first one of these conferences which injected a note of realism into all of this, with the conference president, one of the Emiratis' leading princes, saying that coal and gas would be an important part for a long time of our energy mix, and saying that it's just ridiculous to think that we can suddenly have renewables doing everything, and really taking to task one of the chief eco-alarmists, Mary Robinson, the former Irish president. That was all in the editorial pages, but none of it really made its way into the headlines. And this is where I think our discourse is dominated by ignorant alarmism and sensationalism, even where our thinking is still informed by rather more weighty and mature considerations. The thing that amazes me about the modern world, Dan, and I don't want to sound like I'm a nostalgist, and I certainly don't want to sound like I'm a curmudgeon, but we have never had more information at our fingertips, and yet we have never been more ignorant about the things that count. I mean, how many people read the canonical texts, for instance? How many people have even watched the greatest movies as opposed to Hollywood's latest offerings? And the important thing is to focus on what really matters rather than that which is prurient or sensationalist or, if you like, absorbing trivia.
Well, Tony, I think that's a great place for us to end the conversation today. I know I keep promising our viewers that we'll get to your assessment of the year ahead, but your, I think, exposition on the military and international situation deserve to be elaborated on. So next week we'll touch on some of your further thoughts about the year, but thank you again for a great conversation, Tony. I'm looking forward to next time.
Me too, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.